Bring in Gordon Chang, author of The Coming Collapse of China. Gordon, obviously, we're witnessing a very strong threat coming from North Korea as we just agreed on these sanctions.
Yeah, these sanctions are important, and kudos to Nikki Haley and to the Trump administration for putting them into place and getting 15-0 in the Security Council. But unfortunately, these are incremental. These are just a little bit tighter than the previous 6 set of sanctions, and the North Koreans are able to adjust around them. So what we need to do, if we want to cripple the North Korean missile program, or even if we just want to bring them to the table to talk, what we need to do is go all in, all at once.
What would that take? What would that take?
It would take, for instance, scouring the world, because there are a lot of countries that do business with North Korea. But the other thing that it would take is going after Chinese banks, because they have been money laundering for the North Koreans, and not just the small ones, the big ones. Bank of China, one of China's so-called Big Four banks, was named in a UN report last year for devising and operating a money cleaning scheme for the North Koreans. You walk down this street, Sandra, you will see a Bank of China branch. And the question the Trump administration needs to ask is, why do these guys launder money for North Koreans, do business in the U.S., and have access to dollar accounts in New York?
Walk us through how that plays out. Let's say the Trump administration gets tough with China on sanctioning Chinese banks and Chinese businesses doing business with coal and steel on the Koreans. How do the Chinese respond? How does it affect American trade with China and American relations with China?
I'm sure the Chinese will huff and puff, and they probably will retaliate in some way, but we really don't care. For instance, we are the trade deficit country, $309.8 billion deficit in goods and services last year. Trade deficit countries don't worry too much about trade friction. We have an economy, John, that is in reality about twice as big as China's. We can push them around. We do not have an economy that is geared to selling things to China. China has an economy geared to selling things to us.
I got to take the market stance over here. I mean, one of the biggest problems you have is that our corporations are focused on selling our goods and services into China. If you look, Tim Cook alone said 6 quarters ago that Apple is going to be their that China is going to be their biggest market. Right? There's going to be over 300 million middle-class citizens in China by 2020 that we need to sell to. That's almost the population in the United States here. You have Starbucks going over there trying to sell. I mean, this is jobs here in the U.S. of American companies trying to sell over there.
Yeah, there's no doubt that some American companies will be hurt. And you didn't include in your list GE, which has a lot of investments in China. But if you look at the overall relationship, it really is in favor of the United States. And the question is, there's 2 things. First of all, we cannot allow the Chinese to continue to engage in increasingly predatory practices, because it hurts American companies across the board, not only the ones in China, but also, of course, American workers here. And the other thing is, China is arming the North Koreans. So, for instance, those launches on July 4th and July 28th, the Chinese participated in them because those launchers were Chinese.
So, Shevin, just to throw it back at the markets, this idea that, Apple and GE want to make profits in China, is that morally acceptable when the North Koreans are torturing and enslaving their own people and killing?
I'll tell you this much. Free markets are the greatest growth engine for prosperity that the world has ever known. So if we can get the Chinese economy to go from less communistic to more capitalistic and more business, I mean, people are going to...
Obviously,
it's better for everybody.
Sure, of course it is, but China's moving in the wrong direction. You have Xi Jinping, the current ruler. He's closing the Chinese economy off to the rest of the world. So it is just moving in the wrong direction.
So I want to talk about the reality of this and how realistic it is to think that maybe we might see some action from Washington on this. We spoke earlier to Florida Congressman Ron DeSantis. We asked him about the possibility of issuing sanctions on Chinese companies. Here's what he had to say.
There are some talks. I mean, I actually just passed a part of our defense authorization bill, a measure that would allow our procurement to look at if some of these Chinese companies were dealing with North Korea, that the secretary could then not do business with them. So that's a very small example, but I think it's an important one. So yes, there are thoughts of that.
So he's not ruling it out.
No, certainly. And, there are no good solutions going forward. After you have decades of misguided trade policy and North Korea policy, everything going forward is going to hurt the United States. So we've got to get past this notion that there are costs and no-cost solutions.
Well, the issue, too, is...
Hold on, let's get Kate
How
in
do
here
you
for a
assess
second.
how the president's been handling this, right? Because he talked very tough on China during the campaign as it pertained to trade, but then established a relationship with the Chinese president, then went through the process of being let down by him, which most people expected. He's kind of evolved on the diplomacy front. What do you make of what he's doing now?
That's a great question. And, I think he has moved in the right direction. What we saw at the last week of June with those costs that he imposed on China, for instance, severing Bank of Dandong from the global financial system and doing a couple of other things, that's really the right way. Now, that diplomacy was deft, and the issue is, can he consistently apply pressure on both China and North Korea? And that's going to be tough for any president, and it's going to be tough for this one, who is obviously distracted by a whole bunch of other things. So, yes, but this is so important, and Trump has done one thing which is absolutely correct, and that is he's put North Korea at the top of our list of priorities. No longer are we trying to integrate China into the international system, all the rest of it. What he's trying to do is protect the American people by disarming the North Koreans. If nothing else, that's a precondition to success. It's not sufficient, but it is the precondition.
Your book is The Coming Collapse of China. Tell us, what does that mean? And is China in a position of weakness right now as it relates to President Trump and his negotiations? And is Trump doing the right thing by playing a strong hand with them?
He obviously needs to do that. Xi Jinping, the Chinese ruler, is heading into the 19th Communist Party Congress, which will be held either October or November when they schedule it. Right now, Xi Jinping is in a very precarious position. He has sort of staked his role on being able to push the United States around, and he's done that on a number of occasions quite successfully. If Trump pushes back in this next couple of months, he will delegitimize Xi Jinping, and he will also delegitimize the worst elements in the Chinese political system, which unfortunately happen to be the Chinese military, because they are starting to drive policy in the East China Sea, South China Sea, India.
Why is China going to collapse? Your book says The Coming Collapse of China.
Yeah, because I looked at the economy, and I thought that it would occur by 2011, so I'm obviously out of time. But we see right now a Chinese economy which is indeed fragile, and it's got a debt crisis. They are where we were
Gordon,
in 2007.
what's happening with the population in China?
I think the population in China right now are upset. You can see this because you have unprecedented money flows out of the country. Last 2015, $1 trillion. Last year, probably $1.1 trillion. People are voting with their pocketbooks. Also, China's wealthy. We've done all sorts of surveys over the last 2 or 3 years. They're starting to see, like, 50% of China's wealthy say they want out of the country. Now, obviously, a lot of people can't get out, and I think that they've been coerced by the political system, but they're not really happy right now because the economy is not as good as advertised.
But they're buying real estate here in Toronto.
But at the same time, it's going from an industrialized nation into a consumer nation, and that's good. I mean, it's been growing. I mean, it's going through the growing pains. I mean, think about what just happened, a significant event where they're actually allowing it's going into the emerging market indices. So we're going to be American investors are going to start owning a lot of Chinese companies vis-a-vis their emerging market ETFs and indexes.
At about the wrong time. They're not really moving to a consumption economy. Consumption does account for more of China's gross domestic product, but the problem is that consumption is being driven by investment. And we've seen that because when the government takes its foot off the pedal, consumption starts to shrink again. So clearly it still is an investment-driven economy, despite all of the numbers that have been coming out of Beijing, some of which have been exaggerated.
Wow. All right, Gordon Chang, great of you.